I'm so glad to see you all here today for this event, and this is the final part of our Cucci Office of Local History 16th Annual Roundtable event. I am Dr. Nora Salas. I'm the director of the Cucci Office, and I'm also an associate professor in the history department at Grand Valley. Thank you, yeah. I'm so glad you all could join us. We here at the Cucci Office are very pleased to announce our keynote speaker this year, which I'm going to introduce in a moment. Before I do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about how this is going to go. Dr. Annalisa Cox is going to give her talk. I think we have maybe 45 minutes-ish, give or take, and then we'll have the question and answer session. And during the question and answer comment session, of course, I will be coming around with this mic for you to ask your questions or make your comments. And it's really important that we do that for accessibility purposes so people of different hearing abilities can hear the questions. And also, if you don't ask your questions in the mic, I'm sorry to those of you who are hearing this announcement the third time, but it is quite important. If you don't ask your questions in the mic, then they cannot be heard on the video recording of this talk, which takes away from the content of the talk, as you might imagine. So please keep that in mind when we get to that point. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Annalisa Cox, who is currently a non-resident fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Her original research underpins 2 exhibits at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and her writing has been featured in a variety of publications, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. She is also the author of The Bone and Sinew of the Land, Americans' Forgotten Black Pioneers, and the Struggle for Equality, an excellent book that I recommend that you all purchase or check out of your local library. I know they have a copy of at the Grand Rapids Public Library, so that's an option for you. She is currently at work on her next book and is also working on collecting oral histories from multi-generational African-American farmers in the Midwest with Michigan State University's Center for Regional Food Systems. In her address tonight, she will highlight the multiracial history of West Michigan and its place in the context of the upcoming semi-quincentennial, otherwise known as the 250th commemoration of the founding of the United States, which will be next year. Michigan's Committee for the Semi-Quincentennial has designated Unfinished Revolutions as one of its guiding themes. And this focuses on how the struggle for freedom is an ever-growing and present project that each generation must take up and renew, a fact with which I'm sure we're all intimately familiar at this stage. And she is going to demonstrate how West Michigan's diverse past has embodied this ongoing struggle for freedom, recognition, and rights. And so now I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Annalisa Cox.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight and for hanging on. I know it's been a long day for all of you. I hope I make this talk worth it. I was saying to Nora, the moment we're in is quite a moment. And so this material is really new. I did included some research that I haven't published anywhere else. So this talk is really unique to all of you and to this moment that we're in. So if you've seen my other stuff online, that's wonderful, but there'll be some new stuff here. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, cultivating the ideals of the American Revolution on the West Michigan frontier. I also want to thank Dr. Nora Salas and the Cucci Office of Local History, and to all of you for being here today. I also want to state something that's fairly obvious, but I just want to say it. I am so very white. And that's actually something that one of the African-American farmers that I interviewed said, and yes, it's very true. I also want to point out that it is historians with my skin color at major universities who have done an enormous amount of damage, who have, over the past more than century, until very recently, been denying and burying a lot of these histories. I consider much of what I do to be the study of the history of prejudice, of injustice, just as my non-Jewish colleagues in Germany study the Holocaust and the sins of Germany's past. I am trying, as best I can, to, in my own way, do some reparations as a white historian. And I will get it wrong. So take notes. I love Q&A. And I look forward to getting questions and corrections at the end of this talk. I also note, and you might notice this during my talk, that I often use the term immigrant or settlers to describe those settling here before the Civil War. Obviously, the true citizens, those for whom this land was and is home, were the First Nations, right? The Anishinaabe. Anyone else here were immigrants, descended from immigrants or descended from enslaved people brought to this continent by force. So, my talk will be focusing on the earliest period of settlement in this region, between the 1790s and the 1860s. There is so much myth about the founding era. And I think we're hearing more of this kind of mythical language as we move into this 250th anniversary next year. But we often forget just how revolutionary the Revolutionary era was. And it's important to look at those facts of the past. I'll start at the end. 1863. When this nation was in the middle of a civil war, a war fought over slavery. By 1863, many Michigan men had joined this fight, and an entire Black regiment of Michigan men was being formed, men who would fight and die in the South to end slavery and to ensure that all people in this nation could be free. But on this particular night, I have in mind a white teenage girl from Grand Rapids was much more excited about the fact that she was going to go see the famous opera singer, Elizabeth Greenfield. Miss Greenfield, otherwise known as the Black Swan, was an African-American opera singer. And she was, without a doubt, one of the most famous musicians active in the United States at that time. She was born enslaved in Mississippi in 1819, but freed when she was a child, and then moved to Pennsylvania. She had an astounding talent from an early age, and by the time she was a young woman, she was known for her ability to sing all the way from the bass range to soprano. She became the first Black singer to perform at what would become the Metropolitan Hall in New York City in the early 1850s. By 1853, she was in London with a duchess as her patron and performing for Queen Victoria. The Queen was so impressed by Elizabeth Greenfield's extraordinary talent that she had her chapel composer compose music specifically for the Black Swan's unique voice and range. Now, 10 years later, in 1863, during the height of the Civil War, Elizabeth Greenfield was on tour across the United States, coming to Grand Rapids to sing in the largest hall in the city to a sold-out crowd. Elizabeth Greenfield was also working with Frederick Douglass and others to recruit African-American soldiers to fight in the Civil War, work that she may have been doing while here in Grand Rapids, for there was already an established African-American community in this city by this time. The white teenage girl who went to see this star sing later wrote in her diary that she and her family could hardly believe the range of Miss Greenfield's voice. The teenager was also particularly impressed by the beautiful pink silk gown that Elizabeth Greenfield wore. But I should add here, that a Black woman was not an oddity, not a rarity, but something that this teenager in Grand Rapids would have been used to seeing in this area. For there were African-descended community leaders, business owners, and established farmers already here. I will return to them in a little while, but first, I'm sure all of you are asking, what the heck does this have to do with the American Revolution? Well, let me start with the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I know these are deeply familiar words, but I want to remind all of us how odd these words are, how truly revolutionary, even today. And that these were the words that the Revolutionary War was fought for. We did not win that war until 1783. And these words were what inspired the patriot soldiers, both white and Black, and yes, there were Black patriot soldiers who fought in this war, from the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont all the way down to South Carolina. But this talk is not concerned with the battles of the war, but the battles after. The actions of the diverse founding citizens of this nation and this region. How they lived out those values on the ground. Because words are just words until people make them real. And these real values, enacted by both the Black and white citizens of this new nation, were upholding the founding values of equality and liberty. How they were making them real. I wish I had the time to go into all of this, but this is where I've been beginning to dig really deep. We had racially integrated and equal education, from schools for the youngest children to the most advanced degrees possible in the country. There were integrated churches co-founded by Black and white people. And here, on the ground, in this region, we were governed by an interesting document called the Northwest Territorial Ordinance, written in 1787, when this nation was just 3 years old. This is the United States in 1794. So when the Revolutionary War was won in 1783, we also won this region, right? Which pretty much doubled the land mass of the original 13 colonies. And this ordinance, of course, also took away the rights of the First Nations of this region, rights they were promised by King George III and lost with the loss of the war. But it was still an oddly revolutionary document nonetheless. First, it said no slavery. Yeah, if any of you had the chance, this is on the National Archives website. You can take a look. It's about a 4 or 5 page document. In many ways, it imbues the best ideals of the American Revolution. And one of the first things it said was this entire region would be free of slavery. Okay, big whoop. You say, this is the North, right? Of course there's no slavery. Remember, this is long before the Civil War, long before North and South. We must remember that in 1776, when that Declaration of Independence was written, there was no North, there was no South. Every colony had a really thriving slave trade. Slavery was legal. The second busiest slave importation port in the United States was Providence, Rhode Island. The first was Charleston, South Carolina. The second was Providence, Rhode Island. There was no North, there was no South, right? So This was a completely radical move. I mean, after all, New York was still a slave state in 1787, right? So it's actually the largest piece of land ever to be set aside as free from slavery in the New World up until that point. Now, technically, right? You and what army? But it was there on that piece of paper. The other interesting thing that happens in this document is that the word white is never used, not once. And it is certainly not used to define citizenship. And this meant that there were equal voting rights in this entire region in 1787. Right? This seems pretty weird because, again, so much of what we think is sort of, and so much of what we are being told even today, right, is that questions about racial equity and diversity are modern, capital M, liberal, capital L, right? But we really need to go back to our roots and look at what the founders were actually thinking about equality. Those words from the Declaration of Independence, what do they mean on the ground? What they meant was that in 1792, when George Washington is running for his second term as president, 12 of the nation's 15 states and this entire region, this region we're sitting on right now, right, had written or rewritten their constitutions to remove the word white to make voting rights equal, regardless of race. Now, I realize it was still class-based. It required people to be born here, to be male, to own land, right? But still, this is what the goal and aim was. Even in Georgia, they rewrote their constitution. Why? Because the founding generation, and I'm not talking about the founding fathers, right? I'm talking about the founding citizens, the actual people on the ground. This was, after all, democracy, not a system of royalty, right? It should be about the people. Because they understood that racial prejudice was toxic to a true democracy. Now, I don't use the term racism. I don't use it anywhere in my book. It's a 20th century term. Instead, I use the term prejudice, which is the one that the founding generation used. And I like their usage of it because they see it as a pernicious poison that overtakes the heart and mind of an individual. So they become blinded to the value of somebody else that they're looking at. They understood that prejudice existed, racial prejudice in particular, and that it had always existed and must be fiercely fought in order to have true equality and a true democracy. They understood that prejudice was illogical and stripped human beings of their innate rights. The white revolutionary leader James Otis was one of the best known and most influential American writers of the Revolutionary period. He wrote formal letters of complaint to the British government that were printed and read throughout the colonies. In 1764, right, years before the Declaration of Independence, he wrote, and I quote, and I kind of imagine him working this out in a pub, right, with his tankard of ale, and he was a big guy, bellowing this out. The colonists are by a law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. Does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black? He asks. He added with irony that people with prejudice in their heart like to point to physical differences between people from the African continent and people from Europe as a reason for enslavement. But he argued, and I quote, "Will short, curled hair like wool instead of Christian hair, as 'tis called by those whose hearts are as hard as the nether millstone, help the argument?" End quote. Otis also referred to the brilliant and satirical arguments against prejudice and slavery of the French philosopher, the Baron de Montesquieu, who was a best-selling writer at that time. I'm going to have to skip over his stuff because I want to have time for the rest of it, but I'd encourage you to read his stuff. These were not just fine and funny words. These were powerful new ideas, and they were being used to make revolutionary changes. For Americans were acting on those ideals in a way that the Western world had never seen, like ending slavery in a region that made up almost half the landmass of this new nation. So back to that Northwest Territorial Ordinance of 1787. This document was an encouragement to free people of African descent to move here, for it offered a region free of slavery and the opportunity to become equal citizens with the right to vote. Of course, long before there was a United States, there were Afro-French peoples living and working around the Great Lakes and what would become the Northwest Territory. Some were enslaved alongside Native Americans, as M. Scott Kierman points out in his recent book, The Alchemy of Slavery. But others were free. They spoke many languages, traveled vast distances, and married people belonging to the many nations for whom this land is home. They knew and loved this land that would later become Michigan. One example of many is the Bonga family. The Bonga brothers, who were fur traders and entrepreneurs in the first half of the 1800s, were third-generation Afro-French. They were born at Fort Michilimackinac in the late 1700s. It is important to note here that while many histories are preserved of men, we must always remember that these men had mothers, and while their histories may be lost or just understudied, they were also early residents of this region and often entrepreneurs and brave explorers in their own right. We need to talk numbers here for a minute. I know, right? This can be the least interesting part of history. Numbers and statistics. But in this case, they matter, right? We're in the middle of the city of Grand Rapids. This region is now home to well over 1 million people. As we stand in this hall, it is hard to imagine what this region looked like in the first half of the 1800s, between 1800 and when the Black Swan came here to sing. Numbers matter because people matter. How people know each other, their impact on each other, how they see each other, and there was an intimacy to these numbers. In 1810, the Michigan Territory, which of course did not include the UP, not yet, had approximately 4,700 immigrant settlers, because only immigrants were counted, right? Not the First Nations. By 1830, there was a little over 31,000 immigrants and children of immigrants and children of enslaved people living here in this state. 31,000. Now, this does reflect the growing movement of outsiders into this region. Indeed, the old Northwest Territory was the site of one of the largest immigration movements the planet had ever seen up until this point. Within 50 years of the territory's opening, right, 1787, between the late 1700s and the late 1830s, over 4 million immigrants from the original colonies and nations across the globe poured into the Northwest Territory. It's amazing the planet didn't tip. 50 years, just think, back to like 1975. That was 50 years ago for us today. That was an astounding change. Now, in the first federal census of 1790, which was very challenging and not terribly accurate, the first national census, the total population of this entire nation was just under 4 million non-native people. But let's drill down a bit and get really local. In 1838, Grand Rapids was a little village along this river with less than 1,000 residents, right? In 1840, Detroit was considered a city with around 9,000 residents. By 1860, just before the Black Swan performed here, the population of Grand Rapids had exploded to around 8,000 people. To keep this in perspective, remember today, Grand Haven has a permanent population of around 11,000 people. That's the winter population, not the summer population, right? And until the 1920s, the majority of Americans did not live in cities. They lived in rural frontier areas. And this is true of the diverse African American population in Michigan and the Midwest as well. Part of my own research discovered that by 1860, there were over 330 African American rural farming settlements home to propertied African American farmers in the old Northwest Territory states of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And this was a very visible population. And this is where numbers fail us, I'll be honest. Because if we look at statistics, sometimes those numbers look very small. But this was a very visible minority. One of the examples I like to use is there's a scene in the movie Hidden Figures about African-American women and their role in sort of the moon landing and the space program at NASA in the 1960s. And there's a really important scene where one of these brilliant Black mathematicians is invited into a top secret meeting filled with about 30 white male officials. And she stands in front of a blackboard and she does extraordinary math to help them figure out a problem. Now, statistically, she's one person in that room, right? In a room full of white people. Symbolically, she is much more than that, right? And we have to remember this when we think about diversity on the Michigan frontier, diversity in Grand Rapids, diversity in West Michigan in the frontier era. There were so few people. If you had a successful, pioneering African-American farming family that was here before the Dutch, everybody knew it. Everybody knew it. They were so visible, they were so successful, that soon their presence created a backlash against the founding values of equality. I want to stress that this shift to exclusion, this shift towards prejudice, grew as the population of African-descended people grew and became successful. The rise of prejudiced state constitutions and laws in the Midwest was not because of Black failure. It was because of Black success. I need to repeat that. It was not because of Black failure. It was because of Black success. And many of the white immigrants to the Midwest began to turn their backs on the founding values of this nation before the Civil War, the values of the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. As each of the Northwest Territories became a state, there was a backlash, starting with Ohio in 1803. The word white was added to Ohio's state constitution, thus excluding the very people who voted for the Constitution Convention participants. And there's evidence for this, right? And the white delegates in Michigan unfortunately followed suit, stealing the rights that the founding citizens of Michigan were promised when they came here before statehood. And these African-American founding citizens were excluded from those rights here in Michigan until after the Civil War, despite it repeatedly being put to vote, right? That return to those rights of the Northwest Territorial Ordinance. But none of these prejudicial laws and constitutions went without a fight. In Wisconsin, around the time of the creation of that territory into statehood, a white politician fought hard against making the state constitution prejudiced against Black people. He argued that if something as nonsensical as a difference in hair texture could ban a man from voting, who was next? The Swedes? That was an exact quote. This is roughly 70 years after James Otis thundered out his speech in New England, when this was still a British colony. But you can see that same notion, that same theory. Here in the Grand Rapids area, a number of the early settlers were part of a movement of free African-descended people from the northeastern United States, a group Dr. Randall Jelks terms Afro-Yankees in his important book, African Americans in the Furniture City. To be clear, diversity was the norm from this region, from its earliest days. And diversity does not equal equality. I want to be clear here. But diversity was the norm. And it is racial homogeneity that is the modern artificial invention. In 1853, a Michigan state census was taken and published in 1854. And in 1853, all but 9 counties in this state had African American residents. I want to repeat this. All but 9 counties had African American residents, including the UP. In other words, this state was more racially diverse in 1853 than it is today. And this state census included 60 people counted in Kent County of African descent. And I do want to add here, I realize that state and federal census are often considered the gold standard by historians. But they're far from perfect documents. We always have to ask who gets counted. In some regions in early census records, only people who own property were considered counted because they're the only ones who are citizens, they're the only ones who can vote, right? And who wants to be counted, right? There were people who were freedom seekers, who certainly didn't want a very aggressive federal government who was allied with the elite enslavers of the South to know that they existed in a particular region in Michigan. But what we can see from this interesting, even if it's imperfect, state census, which actually reveals more people of African descent than the federal census does, because African Americans felt safer being counted in a state census record than in a federal one. In the areas we now know as Ottawa, Kent, and Allegan counties, and I wish I had time to go through all of their names, the values of their land, I just don't have time, but I have that if any of you are interested. Here are some of their names and stories, and many of them need further research. This was found in a small archive in Ypsilanti, right? But on the back, it says taken in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the name of the Grand Rapids photography studio where this was taken. And notice what she has by her arm, right? That's symbolic. She wants us to know that she can read, that she is literate. We had William Hardy, born free in New Jersey in 1823 and moved here with his parents to the Michigan territorial frontier in 1827, 10 years before Michigan became a state. When he grew up, he married another African-American Michigan native, Eliza Watts, and they moved to Gaines Township, where he bought large amounts of land in 1846 from the state government in what is now southern Grand Rapids, and became a successful farmer long before Grand Rapids was actually founded as a city in 1850. In 1872, he ran for and won the powerful position as member of the Kent County Board of Supervisors. By 1850, Harris and Josette Elliott were living in Spring Lake. He was born in Kentucky, she was born in Michigan. They would later move to Grand Haven, where they were living in 1860. Edward Stokes and his family was in Allegan County by 1850. By 1860, Thomas and Harriet Huntley were living on their large, successful farm worth over $2,500 in Kent County, both born in New York. James and Penelope Watts from Pennsylvania were also in Kent County by 1860, owning their own valuable farm. James and Molly Morris were also landowning Black farmers in Kent County by 1860. In the city, by 1860, you had Martha Wilson, a grandmother from Virginia, in her own home, a skilled weaver living with her grown sons, John and Henry, one of them married and all of them helping to care for the children. Her son, John, and her son, Henry, were both barbers who owned their own businesses. Henry was married to Jenny, who was from New York. The eldest daughter, Maria, was 7 and had been born in New York. So they had been there from the time had been born in Michigan. So they had been here in Grand Rapids from the time the city had become a city in 1850. There was Darius Roberts from North Carolina, a businessman and a horse trader in Grand Rapids by 1860. Also by 1860, David Lett, born in Virginia around 1811, who was a Baptist preacher in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Hezekiah Smith, a wealthy landowning farmer in Spring Lake Township, Ottawa County, Michigan. Smith Bayou is named for him to this day. He was a fruit farmer, grew award-winning apples and peaches, and captured the infamous murderer Jordan Turpin, a white man, in 1855 and brought him into the jail in chains in his canoe. A Mr. Thomason and a Mr. Kingsbury Taylor were some of the earliest settlers of Cheshire Township, which is between Pullman and Allegan in Michigan. They bought their land directly from Native Americans in the 1830s, rather than wait for that land to be stolen by the federal government, then sold to immigrants. They had thriving farms in Cheshire Township long before the Dutch arrived in what would become Holland, Michigan. By 1860, these two families had convinced James Southers to settle in Cheshire, in Allegan County, and he was a blacksmith. Blacksmiths were essential to life on the frontier. He owned his own business and home, and he had been born in Virginia around 1826. And people moved around. They traveled so much. Today, this region is thought of as kind of, a flyover zone where everybody sort of stays put, which is already a myth, right? But boy, was the founding period a time of movement. And we have to remember the water, the Great Lakes, and the rivers. Those spaces were immensely diverse. That is how people were moving, right? There's no airplanes, there's no roads, there's barely trails. It's a heavily forested region, so your waterways are the ways you're getting around. And those spaces were immensely diverse, which meant that every port town you can imagine, from South Haven to Muskegon, was also racially diverse from its earliest years. So when I say diverse, I mean diverse. I love this painting. So the Battle of Lake Erie was one of the pivotal naval battles of the War of 1812. And historians assume that probably, their research has shown, about 20% of the sailors, the Patriot sailors, were Black in the United States Navy in that battle. Now, they were literally whitewashed out of the record. But this painting is actually very accurate. What I think is interesting is that this painting was painted just after the American Civil War, in which Black soldiers, once again, proved their right to citizenship by fighting, right? So we're having a moment right after the Civil War where the facts and the truth are being remembered and revived and represented. And there's the Underground Railroad. The Great Lakes was probably the most active route of the Underground Railroad, right? You'd get people up or across the Ohio River, they'd go up the Wabash, They'd walk briefly up to that big swamp at the base of Lake Michigan, and they'd get on a ship which had black crew, right? We know so much about the blackjacks of the Atlantic region. As far as I know, there has not been one single peer-reviewed historical book on the Underground Railroad on the Great Lakes. It is work that needs to be done. And it helped the activists, the Black activists of this region of Grand Rapids, to get to where they needed to go. In 1843, the African-American Henry Powers, who is not found on any census, was home here in Grand Rapids, 1843, when it's still a village, right? He traveled from this village of Grand Rapids all the way to the town of Detroit to attend a gathering of African-descended people organized under their own term, a colored convention. The first of these conventions was held nationally in the early 1830s in direct response to the horrific racial massacre of 1829 in Cincinnati, which was unfortunately much like Tulsa, but a century earlier. But the people of Michigan, this newly created state, the African-American people were determined to have their own convention. And Henry Powers went as a leader, noted by name and home location in the surviving programs of this convention. He almost certainly took a ship, taking him north into Lake Superior, around the state of Michigan to Detroit. Why would he make this long and difficult trip? Because he and other African-American leaders, men and women, were determined to win back the rights that they had just lost with statehood, right? The right to vote, the right to equal citizenship. Obviously, women didn't have it, but African-Americans did. Most of the organizers, funders, and leaders were established African-American farmers and included speakers from the Array family, who had arrived as free people of African descent from New Jersey to what would become Michigan in the 1810s. The Array's family patriarch who had led them to Michigan had fought as a patriot soldier in the American Revolution under George Washington. Here is a brief excerpt from one of the speeches that Henry Powers would have heard after he traveled to Grand Rapids, and he would have brought the publication with this speech in it back to Grand Rapids, this village, right, in 1843. And I quote, "In that declaration of fundamental principles set forth by the fathers of '76, we fail to discover anything like a system of exclusion. No, there is not an expression, nor an implied sentiment to be found, making a distinction in the rights and privileges of any class of American citizens. But on the contrary, its first infant breath boldly proclaims that all men are born free and equal, and that consequently, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inherent in every individual, vested inalienably by natural birthright." End quote. In 1863, when the people of Grand Rapids packed into a hall to hear the Black Swan sing, no one could know that the winning of that war would bring Michigan back to its founding values. The white voters of the state of Michigan slowly, oh so slowly, deciding to ratify the 15th Amendment in 1869, which finally returned the right to vote to all men, regardless of the color of their skin. So here we are, almost 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was written. I want to ask you to remember, I would ask all of us to remember that the values of diversity and equality and the fight against racial prejudice are not modern or liberal. They are the values of the founding citizens of this nation. They are the values of the founding document of this region. Values that were enacted, values that were lived out. And we must hold firm to those values, which as much courage and hope as they had, and continue their unfinished revolution. Thank you. I don't think anybody fell asleep.
So
I'd be glad
Thank
for questions, and do wait for
Yes.
the microphone if you could.
The Bonga family that you mentioned early on, was it their children or grandchildren? They had a...
Oh, no, they were the third generation.
Okay. Oh, they were
So
the third.
those two photographs I showed you, those two men are third generation Afro-French.
And
So,
are-
yeah, so they were born at Fort Michelin-Mackinac in the late 1790s, early 1800s too. An African descended woman, right, who was second generation Afro-French, right? So their roots go way back. I mean, what we know is that the Franciscans, the Black Robes, were talking about, Black people here in the Great Lakes region by the 1720s, definitely, yeah.
then
yeah.
it was one of their descendants that had an inn in Mackinac City, or was it Mackinac Island? I can't remember.
So it was Fort Michelin-Mackinac, which I don't think it had moved to the island yet. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. No, but they had an inn, as I understand. They had
Oh.
like a hotel.
I don't know that.
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
that.
they
yeah,
did.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd have to look it up. I have a reference to it.
Okay,
but,
wonderful.
And then just because I'm a big fan of historical markers, there is a relatively new historical marker about Smith's Bayou.
Good. You know
have
what? I
have you seen-
actually helped that community work on that.
Oh, good.
And so I am thrilled to hear that went through and that there's an historical marker there.
And then
Yeah.
another one in Grand Haven at Mulligan's Hollow,
Oh, good.
which mentions
Good.
the early Native Americans meeting there, but also a Black family living in that spot.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Cox, thank you for your opening statements, which always are powerful when we acknowledge whose land we are in and on and stole from, and always acknowledges, in this case, whose people we are, and who you are in that narrative that is bold, that is courageous, and I imagine it can be a little, I am strongly, positively thinking of your encouragement as you humbly share that information. The second thing is thanks for always bleaching whitewashed histories, narratives, and antidotes such that has been colored over is removed and exposed for its true greatness. Number 3, thank you for always sharing info on Africans of the diaspora who were here before the Civil War.
Right.
That is such a my work is after the Civil War, right? The Jim Crow,
And it's such important work too. Yeah,
but you set the stage for informing us and reminding some of us that we were here and flourishing in these northern states, in this territory. Thank you for doing that. Your work is imperative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
CJ. Thank you.
Of course, I'm loud enough, probably could have heard me. But when was the last Black slave alive in Michigan?
That's an interesting question because it kind of, it goes to how you define that, right? Obviously, it was illegal on paper. I know that in 1850, in Michigan, there was at least one enslaved person noted, and they were absolutely described on the census record as a slave, right? That's 1850. And then it all depends on how the court saw it, right? So one of the families that I work very closely with in Van Buren County, he's a farmer who is working land that has been in his family since the 1830s, African-descended farmer. And his grandmother was a freedom seeker who came to Michigan right around the start of the American Civil War. She considered herself free. The courts of the state of Michigan considered her enslaved and returned her during the Civil War to her enslaver after she had lived here years and had married and had children. They captured her and returned her. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that her husband was able to go back and get her out of that space. So, and honestly, there hasn't been as much research on this as there should be. Nobody has written up this incredible story yet. I was able to preserve that in an oral history that I did for the Library of Congress. But there is so much work that needs to be done in this region. There really is. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us maybe a little bit more about the creation of that Northwest Territories kind of governance document, what the impetus was, who was involved in the creation of it.
So there's a lot of mystery surrounding this. And I know there's been an entire book that came out, I think in the 1990s about it, but the jury's still kind of out. They know that it was written at the same time as this nation's Constitution. They're pretty sure it was written in New York City. And some historians have actually posited, because there seems to be some diaries and letters that might indicate this, that the few men, like 2 or 3 men, who were involved in the writing of the Northwest Territorial Ordinance were just in a pub down the road from where the guys were working on the Constitution, and they would go back and forth and talk to each other. What we do know is that there were a lot less cooks in that kitchen than in the federal Constitution, right? So they had a little more freedom to write what they wanted to. And that last little statement about slavery was kind of added at the last minute. It was more strongly worded, and they sent it to, the Congress, and they were like, you have to write it a little differently, but they didn't erase it entirely. The wording and the verbiage of the rights, right, that didn't include white, were lifted almost whole cloth from the recently rewritten North Carolina Constitution, which I think is fascinating. So they obviously knew, again, population's tiny. Everybody's talking to each other, right? And everybody's kind of in this revolutionary mood. And in fact, oddly enough, North Carolina, even though it's a slave state, held on to that equal right to vote for longer than any of the Midwestern states did. They held on to it until 1838. And after they rewrote their Constitution in 1838, you had this massive flood of free, propertied African Americans coming out of North Carolina into this region, because at least they could be in a region that was free of slavery, right? They still didn't have the right to vote. There's an absolutely, I mentioned this in my book, but there's a devastating little excerpt in an Indiana registry book in the 1850s by a wealthy Black widower who's just left North Carolina, propertied, and he wants it recorded as he signs up to be a citizen of the state of Indiana. He's there with his teenage daughter. He wants it recorded that he had the right to vote in North Carolina, right? So this is a wound, right? So again, they don't know exactly the people that were writing this, but it was definitely part of, there's guesses, there's pretty good educated guesses, but it was definitely part of what was going on at this time, right? We're sort of in the air. And I want to add here, historians love to come up with simple answers to complex questions, right? And sometimes we're like, oh, it's the economy, stupid, right? But I'd like to point out that period, that revolutionary period, was a time of almost total chaos, right? We're in debt to the French. We're in debt to the Dutch. We have no navy. We have nothing. We don't even have much of a government. And yet we are still doing these incredibly revolutionary things. New Jersey briefly had the right to vote for women, right? Maybe 7 years. And then the men freaked out, like, right? But, and again in the 1930s, right? Another really revolutionary decade in our nation. We passed Social Security. We started moving forward labor rights. Again, a time of extraordinary economic uncertainty. Whereas the 1920s in this state saw the Ku Klux Klan explode at a time when we were economically very, very stable. So just something to think about. Yeah, that was a digression, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up to that question, any chance, and not to give a simple answer to a complex question, but any chance that the decision to abolish slavery or not permit slavery in the Northwest Territorial Ordinance was actually targeting native forms of enslavement to open up essentially settlement in the region? Because that's certainly, again, I'm not a U.S. historian, but I know that certainly provided justification for the attack on Native polities post-Civil War.
Sure. Actually, it was an incredibly dangerous and, if you look at it, just practically rather stupid thing to do, because the people who were holding the most people enslaved, both indigenous and African descended, were the French in this region. I mean, this region was a French region until the 7 Years' War, right? Or French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it, in the 1760s. So the French are allies. And all of a sudden we're saying, you can't have all those enslaved people, which included a large number of indigenous enslaved people, multiracial enslaved people. And it pissed off the French in this region, who pretty much ignored it. I mean, in some ways they were kind of grandfathered in. There was the really famous or infamous case, the Polly Strong case in Indiana, 1821, so right after Indiana statehood, where an enslaved young woman, enslaved by French elite family in Vincennes, who was active all around the Great Lakes, including Michilimackinac and Detroit, right? And she sued for her freedom in the new state Supreme Court, saying, hey, according to the state constitution and the Northwest Territorial Ordinance, I should be free. Now, scholars have assumed that she was Black, but actually we're just finding out now in the last 2 or 3 years, her mother was indigenous, right? So this was actually a truly just radical and revolutionary thing to do, which was not exactly, it was highly idealistic, not very practical, not actually upheld all the time. Another interesting tension around this, William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of this territory after Ohio became a state, right? And he moves up to Vincennes, builds Grouseland, and he was very pro-slavery. And he kept petitioning the federal government throughout the 1790s. Just 10 years. We just need 10 years of slavery to clear this land, right? Which is too hard of work for white pioneers, right? And there's long been a debate about whether he actually illegally brought enslaved people. Now, he's the governor of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, that entire region, right? And I just got a phone call about 8 months ago from a volunteer at the Knox County Public Library who found an old file fallen behind a shelf in the basement, and there were tax documents in there, including early sort of territorial tax documents showing William Henry Harrison paid tax on 6 or 7 enslaved people. Yeah, nobody's written about it yet, but that's what happened. Meanwhile, his father-in-law, who was a territorial judge, was freeing every single enslaved person who came before him on the bench saying, yup, we're in the territory. This is what it says, right? So this is about like, already you have a small civil war breaking out in this region, right?
I have 2. You can pick which one you want to talk about. Are you ready? So, all right. So one, I think you've addressed a little bit, which is more about, I think we're both at sort of the same interpersonal level. I wonder if you could talk about, like you've talked a little bit about the ordinances and about the paper rights that people had. And so I'm wondering about interpersonal relationships, day-to-day interactions with neighbors during this time period before the Civil War. And my sort of like two-pronged part of this is between Anishinaabe and other indigenous groups and African descended people, right? Because that's a different dynamic than, that's its own dynamic.
Yes.
And it's not sort of just a black-white, indigenous white operation. And then secondly, just for African Americans and their white neighbors as well. So
Whew, that's a big question.
it is. Sorry.
I'll start with the Anishinaabe and the and African descended people in this early region. So it depends on when you're looking, right? Obviously, with the Afro-French, it's a very different relationship, and very symbiotic and enmeshed, right? Both groups are enslaved, both groups are free, and so that's happening, right? And then you have examples like that family that's coming to Allegan County in the 1830s during the Jacksonian clearance era, realizing that that's completely unjust, and being approached by, I think in this case it would have been Pokagon people, and saying, hey, we're about to be forced off our land. We're not going to get a good deal from the federal government, but if you buy it directly from us, right? And that's what they did. Of course, the reality is that a lot of African descended people came here onto land that was unjustly taken, right, from the original people. But Taya Miles wrote a really interesting piece about this. And she wrote Dawn of Detroit about slavery in Detroit. And she's a colleague at Harvard. And she pointed out African American pioneers were refugees, right? They're refugees from prejudice, racial prejudice. They're refugees from slavery when they come here. And Michigan, as soon as it became a state, has black codes, which are incredible financial hurdles to settlement. They're anti-immigration laws against free people of color, right? Basically says you have to have a $500 bond in order to even enter the state. You have to prove that you have this. This is a huge hurdle, right? And in fact, some of the earliest anti-immigration laws ever to occur in this nation occurred in the Midwest. And some of the most vicious. In Illinois, passed an anti-immigration law against free people of African descent in 1848, and then added teeth to it in the 1850s, saying if any free person of African descent enters this state and can't pay their court costs, we will sell them into slavery. So Illinois basically became a slave trading state. So the question of relationships, right, changes depending on time and period. And I would also add here, not to steal from the middle ground, but a lot of the people, especially the Afro-Yankees, who were coming into this region of Michigan, were themselves triracial, right? They might be Narragansett and Scottish and Ghanaian. So they are also, it's sort of that idea of that Richard Wright talked about in the middle ground in the 1600s, right? Late 1600s, of refugees, indigenous refugees arriving in the Great Lakes region and coming to conflict with the people who were here because there's only so many natural resources, right? So it's complicated and complex, but it's a very different narrative than the sort of white manifest destiny immigration story to this region, right? And then in terms of neighborliness, again, this is such an understudied region because if you start off with the myth, the trope, that there are no Black people in the Midwest before the Civil War, then nobody's studying this, right? And I'm only one person. I'm hoping like more people will start working on this. But one of the reasons I wanted to mention those numbers is that when you have numbers this small, people know each other, right? They're going to the same trading post. They're going to the same general store. They're paying off their land loans at the same land office. And so people know, they know the diversity, right? White immigrants who are coming to this area. And in fact, one of my favorites is a story about Enoch and Deborah Harris, who were the first non-native settlers to what is now Oshtemo Township, coming out of Ohio. And they had a home and, fairly nice home, about a 400-acre farm. And when the first Yankee Yorkers started coming in during Michigan Madness in the 1830s, people would stay at their boarding house, right? So right away, these Yankee Yorkers knew, oh yeah, African-American settlers are here and established long before we got here, right? That's just part of their knowledge. It's part of the narrative that's been denied and whitewashed. Right?
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment, if anybody has anything.
And I'll also stick around for a few minutes afterwards if anybody's a little shy about speaking in public.
Yes. Anybody has an additional comment or question? Walking by some people. I want to thank you so much for bringing this talk to us, for sure. I think we'll bring that to a close. Why don't we give Dr. Cox one more round of applause?
Thank you for coming. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. I'll hang out at the back of the hall if anybody has further questions.
Okay. And I have just a couple of closing remarks here. One thing is there was an evaluation that went around, and it would be great if you could fill that out. We still have the evaluations that I forgot to distribute a little earlier. So if you were here for a previous panel and you want to evaluate it, I can make that happen. Please let me know. I want to thank everybody who supported this event and donated to the Cucci office. There are still many opportunities to support our work. Periodically throughout the event, we had our donation website up there, but also you can go directly to our website anytime. I wanted to thank Ryan and bring him up for a round of applause, but I believe he is outside packing things up. So I will not be able to do that, but please, thanks go to Ryan. I will not be able to embarrass him by making him come up on the stage and giving him this card. Maybe that's the best thanks Ryan could have maybe asked for. That might be it. But he really is our new office coordinator. Some of you might know Mary Williford, who was our previous office coordinator, has since been promoted, and Ryan has stepped in as our new office coordinator, and this is his first roundtable. So if you see him out there, please, on my behalf, be sure to tell him what a good job that he did in doing all the logistics for this event, which really are quite time consuming, and I really could not do it without him. And I want to thank you all, those who came for your first time, those who are returning to the roundtable. We look forward to working with you maybe in the coming year, and please feel free to contact me anytime you want to discuss our West Michigan history. Thank you.